The billionaire tycoon discovered his long-lost love working as a janitor. The Seattle skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Chen's corner office on the 42nd floor of Chen Industries Tower. Rain drummed against the glass, a sound that had become the soundtrack of his success. At 38, Marcus had built a tech empire from a college dorm room idea, transforming cloud storage solutions into a multi-billion-dollar corporation that employed over 15,000 people worldwide. His Italian leather chair creaked as he leaned back, studying quarterly reports that showed another record-breaking profit margin. The numbers should have thrilled him, but lately, success felt hollow. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, reminding him of his evening charity gala, another obligation in a calendar packed with board meetings, investor calls, and networking events that all blurred together. Marcus loosened his Hermes tie and walked to the window. Below, Seattle's evening rush hour created rivers of red and white light streaming through the downtown corridors. Somewhere in that maze of humanity, people were heading home to families, to loved ones, to lives that mattered beyond profit margins and stock prices. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, remembering when his biggest worry was scraping together enough money for gas in his beat-up Honda Civic. That was 20 years ago, back at the University of Washington, when he was just another struggling computer science student with big dreams and empty pockets. Back when he knew what it felt like to love someone so completely that the future seemed painted in brilliant colors instead of corporate gray. Isabella, he whispered to the empty office, her name still causing that familiar ache in his chest. They'd met during his sophomore year in Professor Martinez's advanced programming class. She was a literature major taking the course as an elective, sitting in the back row with a worn paperback novel hidden behind her laptop screen. Her dark hair caught the fluorescent light as she scribbled notes, occasionally glancing up with eyes that held entire universes of dreams and possibilities. Marcus remembered their first conversation. She'd approached him after class, frustrated with a coding assignment that made no sense to her poet's mind. He'd offered to help, and they'd spent 3 hours in the library, her laughter echoing between the stacks as he explained algorithms in terms of storytelling structures. By the end of the semester, they were inseparable. She'd supported his entrepreneurial dreams even when everyone else called them impossible. While his classmates headed to established tech companies with steady paychecks, Isabella encouraged him to take the leap, to start his own company. She worked double shifts at a campus coffee shop to help pay for their tiny studio apartment, never complaining when he spent 18-hour days coding in their makeshift office, a folding table wedged between their bed and kitchenette. "You're going to change the world," she'd whisper on those rare nights when he'd finally close his laptop and crawl into bed beside her. "I can see it in your eyes when you talk about your ideas." But success came with a price neither of them had anticipated. As Chen Industries grew, so did the demands on his time and attention. Investors wanted meetings, potential clients needed presentations, and the weight of building something revolutionary pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. Isabella tried to be understanding, but he could see the loneliness creeping into her eyes during the long nights when he'd return home to find her asleep at the kitchen table, a half-finished poem abandoned beside her cooling tea. The breaking point came during his senior year, when a major venture capital firm offered him $2 million in seed funding. The celebration dinner he'd planned turned into another late-night strategy session with lawyers and financial advisors. Isabella sat across from him at their favorite Thai restaurant, watching him field phone calls while their pad Thai grew cold between them. "When did we stop being us?" she'd asked quietly when he finally hung up. He'd looked at her then, really looked, and seen the exhaustion in her face, the way she'd started fading into the background of his expanding world. But instead of slowing down, instead of remembering what truly mattered, he'd made the choice that would haunt him for the next 2 decades. "This is temporary," he'd said, already reaching for his phone as it buzzed with another call. Once the company is established, things will be different, but they both knew it was a lie. Success was addictive, and Marcus was already lost to its pull. Isabella had left 3 months before graduation, taking only a single suitcase and leaving behind a letter that he'd read so many times the edges had worn soft. She'd written about love not being enough when someone stops seeing you, about dreams that couldn't survive in the shadow of ambition, about needing to find herself before she disappeared completely. Now, standing in his corporate tower, Marcus understood what she'd meant. He'd gained everything he'd thought he wanted, and lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The Chen Industries building hummed with the quiet energy of after-hours activity, while most employees had long since departed for their evening commutes. Marcus found himself working later and later, avoiding the silence of his Bellevue penthouse. His corner office had become a refuge from the emptiness that seemed to expand with each passing year. It was past 9 p.m. when he finally gathered his things, his reflection ghost-like in the darkened windows. The elevator descended through floors of dimmed offices and conference rooms, each level a reminder of the empire he'd built on the foundation of Isabella's dreams. He'd kept every promise to himself except the one that mattered, the one about becoming someone worthy of the love he'd thrown away. The lobby marble echoed with his footsteps as he crossed toward the main entrance, nodding to Jerry, the night security guard who'd worked the building for 15 years. "Burning the midnight oil again, Mr. Chen?" Jerry asked, his weathered face creasing into a familiar smile. "Something like that," Marcus replied, pausing to make conversation with one of the few people in his daily life who treated him like a human being rather than a walking stock portfolio. "How's your grandson doing with his college applications?" "Real good, thanks to that scholarship program your company set up. Kid's got his heart set on studying environmental science at UW, says he wants to save the world." Jerry's pride was evident in every word. Marcus felt a hollow pang in his chest. 20 years ago, he'd had that same fire, that same belief that technology could solve humanity's greatest challenges. Now his innovations mostly helped corporations store data more efficiently. Profitable, but hardly world-changing. "That's wonderful, Jerry. The world needs people who still believe they can make a difference." As Marcus pushed through the revolving door into the Seattle night, he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. Someone was emptying trash bins in the lobby, moving with quiet efficiency between the seating areas and information desk. Night cleaning crews were invisible to most executives, part of the building's infrastructure, like the heating system or Wi-Fi network. But something about the figure's graceful movements made him pause on the sidewalk outside. Through the glass walls, he watched as the janitor reached to empty a high-mounted waste receptacle, her dark hair catching the lobby's recessed lighting. There was something familiar about the way she moved, a fluid economy of motion that triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. Marcus shook his head, chalking it up to exhaustion and the strange melancholy that had been haunting him lately. He pulled out his phone to call his driver, but the app showed a 20-minute wait due to surge pricing from a Mariners game letting out downtown. The autumn air was crisp and clear, unusual for Seattle in October, so he decided to walk the few blocks to his car in the underground garage. The sidewalks bustled with the city's nightlife, young professionals heading to trendy bars in Belltown, couples walking hand in hand toward Pike Place Market, street musicians setting up near the waterfront. Marcus had lived in Seattle his entire adult life, but he realized he'd experienced very little of it beyond the corporate corridors and high-end restaurants where he conducted business. His Tesla Model S sat alone on the executive level of the parking garage, its black surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. As he settled into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed with notifications. Emails from his marketing director about tomorrow's product launch, a text from his personal trainer confirming their morning session, a reminder about his mother's birthday, next week. 20 years of success, and his phone contained the entirety of his personal relationships. No random messages from friends, no romantic photos, no inside jokes or shared memories. Just the digital detritus of a life lived entirely, in service to achievement. The penthouse elevator rose silently through 30 floors of luxury condominiums, each passing level marked by subtle chimes that counted off his isolation. His unit took up the entire top floor, with panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains. Interior designers had created spaces that belonged in architectural magazines, all clean lines, expensive materials, and carefully curated art that impressed visitors but held no personal meaning. Marcus poured himself 3 fingers of 18-year-old Macallan and stood on his terrace, watching ferries navigate the dark waters between Seattle and Bainbridge Island. The whiskey burned pleasantly, but it couldn't warm the cold emptiness that had taken residence in his chest. He thought about Jerry's grandson, about young people who still believed they could save the world, about the dreams he'd once shared with someone who'd seen past his ambition to the person he'd hoped to become. Isabella had believed in the version of himself that existed before success calcified his heart into something harder and more brittle than the business deals that filled his days. The city lights blurred through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Marcus closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be 22 and in love, when the future stretched ahead like an unwritten story and every day brought new possibilities. He'd traded all of that for a corner office and a net worth that Forbes celebrated annually. But standing alone in his architectural masterpiece, he finally understood the true cost of his choices. Somewhere in the city below, people were falling, asleep next to the ones they loved, their dreams intertwined with hopes and plans that didn't revolve around profit margins. Marcus finished his whiskey and headed to his bedroom, knowing that his dreams would be filled with memories of dark hair catching fluorescent light and the echo of laughter in library stacks, ghosts of a happiness he'd convinced himself was just the price of success. 3 days later, Marcus found himself staying late again, though this time it wasn't entirely by choice. A server crash in their European data centers had required his direct attention, and by the time the issue was resolved, the October sky had already surrendered to an early darkness. The building's cleaning crew was beginning their nightly routine. As he finally prepared to leave, he'd noticed them before, a small team of mostly older immigrants who worked with quiet dignity, invisible to the executives who generated the mess they cleaned each night. Marcus had always prided himself on treating service workers with respect, a habit inherited from his own working-class parents, but he realized with some shame that he'd never actually seen them as individuals with their own stories and struggles. Tonight felt different. Perhaps it was Jerry's earlier comment about perspective, or maybe the melancholy that had been settling over him like Seattle's persistent drizzle. But Marcus found himself actually observing the cleaning crew as they moved through the lobby. Each person carried themselves with a particular dignity. The older man who hummed quietly while polishing the marble floors, the woman who carefully arranged magazines in perfect fans across coffee tables, the younger man who treated each window like a canvas requiring artistic precision. And then he saw her again. She was kneeling beside the elevator bank, carefully wiping down the brass fixtures that most people touched without thinking. Her hair fell forward as she worked, creating a curtain that partially obscured her profile, but something about the concentration in her movements, the careful attention to detail, struck a chord of recognition that vibrated through his entire body. Marcus stopped walking. His leather briefcase suddenly felt impossibly heavy in his hand. The woman looked up, perhaps sensing his stare, and their eyes met across the expanse of polished marble. Time seemed to collapse, 20 years folding, into a single moment of impossible recognition. The same dark eyes that had looked at him with love and disappointment, the same face that had haunted his dreams and regrets, the same spirit that had once believed he could change the world. Isabella. Her name escaped his lips as barely a whisper, but in the lobby's acoustic perfection, it carried across the space between them like a stone thrown into still water. She froze, her cleaning cloth suspended in mid-motion, her face cycling through emotions too complex and rapid for him to follow. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been pain, and then a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. She stood slowly, smoothing down her navy blue uniform shirt with hands that he remembered sketching poetry in notebook margins. Hands that had once traced the outline of his dreams across late-night conversations and shared ambitions. "Mr. Jen," she said formally, her voice carrying the slight accent that had always made his name sound like music. 20 years had added lines around her eyes and silver threads through her dark hair, but she was still breathtakingly beautiful in a way that transcended physical appearance, the kind of beauty that came from depth of character and strength, earned through hardship. The formal address hit him like a physical blow. He was no longer Marcus, the struggling student who'd shared ramen noodles and impossible dreams in a studio apartment smaller than his current walk-in closet. He was Mr. Chen, the billionaire CEO whose success story had made the cover of Business magazines, whose name appeared on buildings and scholarship funds and charity galas. He was everything he'd thought he wanted to become, and nothing that mattered to the woman standing before him. "Isabella," he repeated, his voice stronger this time but still carrying the weight of 2 decades of regret. "I can't believe." "What are the chances?" She glanced around the lobby, suddenly aware that their conversation was taking place in his corporate headquarters, surrounded by the monuments to the success he'd chosen over their relationship. Jerry was pretending not to watch from behind his security desk, but Marcus could see the curiosity in the older man's posture. "Small world," Isabella said carefully, her professional demeanor remaining intact, even as her knuckles whitened around the cleaning cloth. "Seattle's not as big as people think." Marcus wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Where had she been? What had happened to her writing? Why was she here? Did she ever think about their time together? Did she hate him for the choice he'd made? But the questions crowded in his throat, and all he could manage was the most inadequate response possible. You look good." The words hung between them, insufficient and almost insulting in their banality. Isabella's expression flickered, with something that might have been amusement or annoyance. He'd never been good at reading her when she retreated behind walls of self-protection. "Thank you," she replied politely. "I should get back to work. These floors won't clean themselves." She began to turn away, and Marcus felt 20 years of wondering and regret crystallizing into a moment of desperate clarity. He couldn't let her disappear again, couldn't let this chance encounter dissolve into another chapter of what if and might have been. "Isabella, wait." His voice carried more authority than he'd intended, the executive tone that commanded boardrooms and silenced position. She stopped but didn't turn around, her shoulders tensing in a way that told him she was preparing for whatever came next. Could we talk? Maybe coffee sometime? I know this is strange, running into each other like this, but Mr. Chen. She turned back to face him, and her voice carried a quiet strength that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her all those years ago. "I appreciate the gesture, but I don't think that's a good idea. Too much time has passed. Too much has changed." She gestured subtly around the opulent lobby, the marble and brass and architectural grandeur that represented everything he'd chosen instead of her. The movement encompassed not just the physical space, but the entire universe of difference that now existed between their worlds. "Some changes don't matter," Marcus said quietly, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. Some things stay the same." For just a moment, Isabella's carefully constructed professional mask slipped, and he saw something vulnerable and familiar in her expression. But then she pulled the walls back up, square her shoulders with the dignity of someone who'd learned to protect herself from exactly this kind of hope. "Good night, Mr. Chen," she said firmly, and this time when she turned away, he didn't try to stop her. Marcus stood alone in the lobby, watching her disappear into the service corridors that existed parallel to but separate from the world he inhabited. 20 years of success, and he'd never felt more like a failure. Marcus couldn't focus on anything the next morning. The quarterly budget meeting that should have commanded his full attention became background noise as his mind replayed every second of the previous night's encounter. He found himself staring out his office windows, wondering which of the tiny figures on the sidewalks below might be Isabella, walking to another job, living a life he knew nothing about. His assistant, Patricia, knocked and entered with his usual afternoon coffee, her expression showing the concern of someone who'd worked with him long enough to recognize when something was wrong. "The Johnson presentation needs your review," she said, setting the cup on his desk. "And your mother called about dinner plans for her birthday." Marcus nodded absently, then looked up at Patricia with a question that had been forming since dawn. "Patricia, what do you know about our cleaning crew?" She blinked, clearly not expecting that particular inquiry. "The janitorial staff? They're contracted through Morrison Services, I believe. Why do you ask?" "Just curious about their employment conditions, benefits, that sort of thing." Marcus tried to keep his voice casual, but Patricia's raised eyebrows suggested he wasn't entirely successful. "Part of our corporate responsibility initiatives." Patricia made a note on her tablet. "I can have HR pull together a report on our contracted service agreements if you'd like." After she left, Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon in a distracted haze, signing documents without reading them and responding to emails with uncharacteristic brevity. By 6 o'clock, he'd made a decision that would have seemed insane to the version of himself that existed 24 hours earlier. Instead of leaving through the executive elevator to the parking garage, Marcus took the main elevator to the lobby and positioned himself at Jerry's security desk with a stack of papers that didn't need his immediate attention. He pretended to review contracts while watching for the cleaning crew's arrival. Isabella appeared at 7:15, wearing the same navy uniform and carrying a small backpack that looked like it had seen better decades. She moved with the same efficient grace he remembered, but there was something different about her posture, a wariness that hadn't existed when they were young and invincible. Marcus waited until she'd begun her routine in the far corner of the lobby before approaching. This time, he'd prepared what he wanted to say, rehearsing the words like a presentation to skeptical investors. "Isabella." She looked up from organizing magazines on a coffee table, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Chen, working late again?" "I was hoping to see you," he admitted. "I know you said talking wasn't a good idea, but I can't stop thinking about last night, about seeing you again after all this time." Isabella glanced around the lobby, noting Jerry's studied disinterest in the absence of other witnesses. "This isn't appropriate. I'm at work." "Then let's talk somewhere else. After your shift or tomorrow, or whenever works for you." "Please." Marcus heard the desperation creeping into his voice and tried to rein it in. "5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." Isabella's hands stilled on the magazine she'd been arranging. For a long moment, she studied his face with the intensity that used to make him feel like she could see straight through to his soul. "Why now?" she asked quietly. 20 years, Marcus. 20 years of nothing, and now you want 5 minutes? The use of his first name hit him with unexpected force. Not Mr. Chen. Not the formal distance she'd maintained, but Marcus. The name she'd whispered in their tiny apartment. The name she'd called out across campus quads. The name she'd written at the top of love letters he'd kept in a box he couldn't bring himself to throw away. "Because I was an idiot," he said simply. "Because I made the worst mistake of my life. And seeing you again made me realize that some regrets never stop hurting." Isabella stood slowly, her dark eyes searching his face for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or evidence of the person she'd once loved beneath the layers of success and corporate armor. "I get off at midnight," she said finally. "There's a diner on Pine Street called Rosie's. If you're still interested in those 5 minutes by then, I'll be there until 12:30. She turned back to her work, effectively dismissing him. But Marcus felt a surge of hope that he hadn't experienced in years. It was a small opening, barely a crack in the wall she'd built around herself, but it was enough. The next 4.5 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Marcus tried to work, tried to focus on the endless stream of emails and documents that normally consumed his evenings. But his mind kept drifting to Rosie's diner and the conversation that would either provide closure or reopen wounds that had never properly healed. At 11:45, he stood outside the diner's steamed windows, watching late-night diners nurse cups of coffee and pick at plates of comfort food. The neighborhood was a mix of students from Seattle University and service workers ending late shifts, a demographic he'd once belonged to but hadn't interacted with in years. Isabella arrived at exactly midnight, having changed from her uniform, into jeans and a worn leather jacket that he remembered from their college days. She'd always had an eye for timeless pieces that aged beautifully, unlike his own wardrobe of expensive clothes that went out of style before the season ended. They chose a corner booth, the vinyl seats cracked with age and countless conversations. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and comfortable shoes, poured coffee without being asked and left them alone with the weight of 2 decades between them. "So," Isabella said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "You have 5 minutes. What did you want to say?" Marcus looked at her across the scarred Formica table, this woman who'd believed in him when he was nobody, who'd supported his dreams even when they required sacrificing her own, who'd loved him enough to walk away when staying would have destroyed them both. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he began, "and I wanted to ask if you're happy." Isabella's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained up. "That's 2 very different conversations, Marcus." "Then let's start with the apology," he said. "I'm sorry for choosing ambition over love. I'm sorry for making you invisible in your own relationship. I'm sorry for being too young and stupid to understand what I was throwing away." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the diner's fluorescent lighting. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of processing pain and disappointment. "I waited for you to choose me," she said quietly. "Every day for months I waited for you to remember that I existed, that we existed. But you were already gone, weren't you? Already living in that future where success mattered more than love." Marcus wanted to protest, to defend the young man but the words died in his throat because she was right. He had been gone, seduced by the possibility of empire building and legacy creation, blind to the treasure he already possessed. "Yes," he admitted, "I was gone. And losing you was the price I paid for everything I thought I wanted." Isabella nodded, slowly, as if his honesty had answered a question she'd been carrying for 20 years. "And now?" she asked. "Are you happy with the trade you made?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning 20 years of separate lives and accumulated regrets. Marcus stared into his coffee, seeing his reflection distorted in the dark surface, and realized he'd never allowed himself to answer that question honestly. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not happy. I'm successful, I'm wealthy, I've achieved everything I thought I wanted, but I'm not happy. I wake up every morning in a penthouse apartment that feels like a museum, surrounded by things that impress other people but mean nothing to me. I go to work in a building with my name on it, make decisions that affect thousands of employees, and come home to silence." Isabella listened without judgment, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug like an anchor. The diner's late-night atmosphere created an intimate bubble around their conversation, insulating them from the outside world and the vast differences in their current circumstances. "What happened to your writing?" Marcus asked, turning the conversation toward her. "You were so talented, so passionate about poetry and literature. I always imagined you'd become the next great American novelist." A shadow passed across Isabella's face, and she was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if he'd overstepped some invisible boundary. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of dreams deferred and practical realities. "Life happened," she said simply. "After I left Seattle, I moved back to Phoenix to help care for my father. He'd been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, and my mother couldn't handle it alone. I got a job at a local newspaper, thinking I'd write the great American novel in my spare time. But spare time became a luxury I couldn't afford." She paused, and Marcus saw the careful way she chose her words, protecting herself even in explanation. "Dad passed away 5 years ago, and by then, Mom's health was failing too. The medical bills, the care facilities, the constant worry. It consumed everything. Writing became something I used to do, like playing piano or speaking French, a skill that atrophied from disuse." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, and meant it. "I had no idea you were dealing with all of that." Isabella shrugged with practiced acceptance. "We all make choices based on what matters most at the time. You chose your company. I chose my family. Neither of us was wrong. But Marcus heard the careful diplomacy in her response, the way she'd learned to minimize her own sacrifices to avoid seeming bitter or resentful. He recognized the pattern because he'd mastered it himself, the art of making your disappointments sound like conscious choices. "Why Seattle?" he asked. "Why come back here?" "Mom passed last year," Isabella said quietly. "After the funeral, I realized I'd spent 15 years living other people's lives, caring for my parents, working jobs that paid the bills but didn't fulfill me, existing instead of living. Seattle was where I'd been happiest, where I'd felt most like myself. I thought maybe I could find that person again." "And the cleaning job?" Isabella's smile was rueful, but not ashamed. "It pays better than you'd think, especially the overnight shifts. And there's something peaceful about it, taking chaotic spaces and making them clean and organized. It's honest work, and after years of dealing with insurance companies and medical bureaucracies, I appreciate honesty." Marcus felt a familiar stab of admiration for her resilience and dignity. She'd faced challenges that would have broken many people, and emerged with her essential kindness intact. Meanwhile, his greatest hardship had been choosing between luxury car models. "Are you writing again?" he asked. "Some," she admitted. "I've been taking a creative writing class at Seattle Central College. The instructor thinks I have potential, which is encouraging for someone who's 42 and starting over." The waitress refilled their coffee cups, and Marcus realized they'd been talking for over an hour. Isabella's initial defensiveness had gradually dissolved, replaced by the easy conversation rhythm they'd once shared. But he could see the wariness still lurking behind her eyes, the protective instincts of someone who'd learned not to trust too easily. "Isabella," he said carefully, "I know this might sound presumptuous, but I'd like to help. With your writing, I could—" "No." Her response was firm but not unkind. "Marcus, I appreciate the gesture, but I can't accept charity from you. It would change everything between us, make me dependent in a way that would poison any friendship we might rebuild." "It wouldn't be charity," Marcus protested. "It would be an investment in someone whose talent I've always believed in." Isabella shook her head, and he saw steel beneath her gentle exterior, the strength that had allowed her to rebuild her life from scratch at an age when most people were settling into established routines. "I need to do this myself," she said. "I need to know that whatever I achieve is mine, earned by my own efforts. You can probably understand that." Marcus did understand, perhaps better than she realized. He remembered the fierce independence that had driven him to build his company from nothing, the need to prove himself worthy of success. But he also understood something else, that true success meant nothing without someone to share it with. Then, "Let me ask you something different," he said. "Would you have dinner with me? Not as a gesture of charity or an attempt to recapture the past, but as two people who once cared about each other and might like to know who they've become." Isabella studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus held his breath, afraid that any movement might tip her decision toward rejection. "One dinner," she said finally. "Somewhere normal where we can talk without you feeling like you need to impress me or me feeling like I don't belong." "Anywhere you want," Marcus said, and meant it. Isabella smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and for a moment the years fell away and he glimpsed the woman who'd once believed he could change the world. "There's a little Italian place in Capitol Hill," she said. "Pasta and wine and conversation. Nothing fancy, nothing intimidating. Just dinner." As they left the diner together, stepping into the cool Seattle night, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. The possibility of happiness that didn't depend on profit margins or stock prices or business magazine covers. Walking beside Isabella through the quiet streets, he understood that some second chances were worth more than all the first chances in the world. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, creating a constellation at their feet. And for the first time in decades, Marcus Chen looked up at the stars instead of down at his phone. ready to discover what the future might hold when love was given a second chance to bloom.